In the unforgiving mountains of Afghanistan, where death whispers through every shadow and trust is a luxury few can afford, Lieutenant Sarah Chun made a choice that would either save dozens of lives or end her military career forever. What started as a routine reconnaissance mission became a deadly game of cat and mouse, where the line between ally and enemy blurred like morning mist over razor-sharp peaks. When Navy SEALs spotted movement at 2,000 meters through their scopes, they expected to find insurgents. Instead, they discovered something far more dangerous and unexpected, a lone figure emerging from the fog with precision that defied explanation and skills that shouldn't exist. This is the true story of how one woman's split-second decision in those treacherous mountains changed everything the Special Forces thought they knew about warfare, loyalty, and survival. Some stories are born in the heat of battle. Others are forged in the cold silence before the storm breaks. This one began when Sarah Chun disappeared into enemy territory with nothing but her training, her rifle, and a mission that officially never existed. The morning air in the Hindu Kush Mountains bit through even the thickest tactical gear as Lieutenant Sarah Chun adjusted her scope for the third time in 20 minutes. The fog rolled between the peaks like ghostly fingers, making visibility a constant battle against nature itself. She had been lying prone on the rocky outcrop for nearly 6 hours, her body cramped and cold, but her mind sharp as the blade of her combat knife. Sarah's mission was supposed to be simple. Intelligence had indicated that a high-value target would be moving through the valley below sometime before dawn. Her job was to observe, report, and, if necessary, eliminate. What intelligence had failed to mention was that this particular valley had become a hunting ground for multiple factions, and she was about to become the hunted. The radio crackled softly in her earpiece. Whisper 7, this is command. Status report. Her call sign felt appropriate, given how quietly she moved through these mountains, like a ghost that left no trace. Command, Whisper 7. Target area remains quiet. Visibility is poor due to weather conditions. Maintaining overwatch position. Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper, trained through years of operations where a single misplaced word could mean death. She had joined the Army straight out of college, driven by a need to prove herself in a world that constantly questioned whether women belonged in combat roles. Growing up in rural Montana, she had learned to shoot before she could ride a bike properly. Her father, a Vietnam veteran, had taught her that marksmanship wasn't just about steady hands and good eyes. It was about patience, discipline, and the ability to make impossible decisions in split seconds. The fog began to thin as the sun climbed higher, revealing the treacherous terrain below. Sarah could see the narrow mountain pass where her target was expected to appear. What she couldn't see were the 6 Taliban fighters who had been tracking her position for the past 2 hours, moving with the kind of patience that only comes from fighting in your homeland. Through her scope, movement caught her attention. A convoy of 3 vehicles was making its way through the valley, moving faster than expected. Sarah focused her lens and felt her heart rate increase. The lead vehicle matched the description of her target's expected transport, but something felt wrong. The convoy was moving too openly, too confidently for a high-value target trying to avoid detection. Her training kicked in as she began calculating distances, wind speed, and bullet drop. The range was approximately 800 meters, well within her capabilities but challenging given the mountain air and shifting wind patterns. She had made longer shots under worse conditions, but never with so much uncertainty about what she was actually looking at. The radio crackled again. Whisper 7. Drone surveillance confirms your target is in the lead vehicle. You are cleared to engage when ready. Sarah felt the familiar calm that settled over her before a shot. Her breathing slowed, her heartbeat steadied, and the world narrowed to nothing but the crosshairs in her scope and the target below. She placed her finger on the trigger and began the slow, deliberate squeeze that would end a life from nearly half a mile away. Then, everything changed. The explosion came from behind her, close enough that the shockwave knocked her sideways and filled her ears with ringing. Her carefully positioned rifle tumbled down the rocks as Sarah rolled for cover, her mind racing to understand what had just happened. Through the smoke and dust, she could hear voices shouting in Pashto. close enough that she could make out individual words. Sarah drew her sidearm and tried to assess her situation. Her primary weapon was gone, scattered somewhere in the rocks below her position. Her radio had been damaged in the explosion, leaving her cut off from command and any possibility of extraction. The convoy in the valley had stopped, and she could see armed figures emerging from the vehicles, clearly aware that someone had been watching them. But the immediate threat was much closer. She could hear at least 3, maybe 4 men moving through the rocks above her position, speaking in hushed but urgent tones. They had found her observation post and were now systematically working their way down to flush her out. Sarah realized with crystal clarity that she was completely alone in enemy territory with no support and limited ammunition. The survival training kicked in as she evaluated her options. Moving down the mountain would put her directly in the path of the convoy she had been sent to observe. Moving up would take her deeper into Taliban-controlled territory. Staying in place meant certain capture or death once her hunters worked their way to her hiding spot. Sarah chose a fourth option that wasn't in any manual. She would hunt the hunters. Moving with the careful precision that had made her one of the army's top marksmen, she began working her way laterally across the mountain face, using every piece of cover the harsh terrain provided. Her goal was to circle around behind the men who were hunting her, turn the tables before they realized what was happening. The first Taliban fighter appeared in her sights as he carefully picked his way down through the rocks, his AK-47 ready, but his attention focused below where he expected to find her. Sarah had positioned herself behind a boulder roughly 40 meters away, close enough that she couldn't miss, but far enough that the sound of her shot would echo off the mountains, making it difficult to pinpoint her location. She took the shot. The man dropped without a sound, and Sarah was already moving to a new position before his body hit the ground. The other hunters would have heard the gunshot, but in these mountains, sounds bounced and twisted until it was nearly impossible to determine their origin. She had maybe 30 seconds before they figured out what had happened. The second fighter was more cautious, moving in short bursts from cover to cover. Sarah waited, following his pattern until she could predict where he would appear next. When he emerged from behind a large rock formation, she was ready. Another clean shot, another enemy down. Now the remaining hunters knew they were being hunted. The dynamic had completely shifted, and Sarah could hear them calling to each other, their voices carrying a note of fear that hadn't been there before. They had expected to find a trapped American soldier, not a ghost who could kill from the shadows. Sarah continued her deadly game of cat and mouse, using every skill she had learned in years of training and deployment. The mountain terrain that had seemed so hostile now became her ally, providing countless hiding spots and firing positions. She moved like water, always flowing to where she was least expected. The third fighter made a critical mistake. Panicked by the death of his companions, he broke cover and ran for a better position, exposing himself for the few seconds Sarah needed. Her shot caught him center mass, and he tumbled down the rocky slope, his weapon clattering away into a crevice. One enemy remained, and he was smart enough to stay hidden. Sarah could hear him moving, but he was being careful, using the terrain and staying out of sight. This was the dangerous part, when a cornered fighter becomes unpredictable and desperate. Minutes passed in deadly silence. Sarah knew he was out there, probably trying to work his way around to flank her position. She had to make a decision: wait for him to make a mistake, or force the issue by becoming the aggressor. The choice was made for her when she heard the distinctive sound of a grenade pin being pulled. She had perhaps 3 seconds to move before the explosion would bring down half the mountain face on top of her. Sarah launched herself sideways, rolling and scrambling for any cover she could find. The grenade detonated with a roar that echoed through the valley below. Rocks and debris rained down as Sarah found herself pressed against a boulder, her ears ringing and dust filling her lungs. Through the settling debris, she saw the last Taliban fighter emerge from his hiding spot, confident that his grenade had finished the job. He was wrong. Sarah's final shot was taken from an impossible position, firing around the edge of her cover at a target partially obscured by smoke and falling rocks. It was the kind of shot that shouldn't have been possible, the kind that happens only when training, instinct, and desperation combined into something beyond normal human capability. The fighter dropped, and, suddenly, the mountain was quiet except for the settling of disturbed rocks and the distant sound of vehicles in the valley below. Sarah remained motionless for several minutes, listening and watching for any sign that more enemies were approaching. When she was satisfied that she was alone, she began the careful process of retrieving her equipment and assessing her situation. Her primary weapon was damaged, but functional. Her radio was completely dead. Her position had been compromised, and she had no way to contact command for extraction. The convoy in the valley had disappeared while she was fighting for her life, which meant her original mission was a complete failure. But Sarah Chun was alive, and in the brutal mathematics of mountain warfare, sometimes survival was the only victory that mattered. She gathered her gear, checked her ammunition supply, and began planning her next move. What she didn't know was that her gunfight had been observed through high-powered scopes by a Navy SEAL team positioned on a ridge nearly 2 miles away. They had watched the entire engagement unfold, seen a lone figure systematically eliminate 4 enemy fighters in a display of marksmanship and tactical skill that left even these elite operators impressed. The SEALs had been tracking the same convoy that Sarah was supposed to eliminate, part of a larger operation that Command had failed to mention in her briefing. They had seen the explosion, watched her fight for her life, and witnessed shooting that bordered on the supernatural. Now they were faced with a problem. Their mission parameters didn't include rescue operations, and they had their own objectives to complete. But they had just watched someone demonstrate skills that could be invaluable to their operation if they could figure out who she was and whether she could be trusted. The convoy tracks led deeper into the valley, winding through terrain that seemed designed to swallow armies whole. Sarah followed at a careful distance, using every piece of cover the harsh landscape provided. The morning sun had burned off most of the fog, revealing the true scope of the mountains that surrounded her on all sides. She was deep in Taliban country now, farther from friendly forces than she had ever been. Her damaged radio occasionally crackled with static, but no clear communication came through. Sarah had tried multiple frequencies, hoping to reach anyone, who could provide guidance or extraction. The silence was more unsettling than the gunfight she had survived hours earlier. In combat, at least you knew where you stood. This isolation was a different kind of enemy, one that attacked your mind rather than your body. The tracks were easy to follow in the soft dirt of the valley floor. 3 vehicles, heavily loaded based on the depth of the tire impressions, moving at a steady pace toward what appeared to be a narrow pass between 2 towering peaks. Sarah checked her map, trying to determine where this route might lead, but the topographical details were sparse for this region. She was operating in a zone that existed at the edge of reliable intelligence. As she moved, Sarah's training kept her constantly alert to potential threats. She varied her pace, changed her route frequently, and stopped regularly to scan the ridgelines above for any sign of movement. The Taliban fighters she had killed on the mountain wouldn't be missed for hours, maybe days, but their absence would eventually be noticed. When that happened, these valleys would become even more dangerous. The sound reached her before she saw anything. Vehicle engines, multiple units, echoing off the valley walls in a way that made it impossible to determine exact direction or distance. Sarah immediately moved to cover behind a cluster of boulders and began scanning the terrain ahead with her damaged scope. The convoy she had been tracking was stopped in a wider section of the valley, perhaps 800 meters ahead. The 3 vehicles were arranged in a defensive position, and Sarah could see armed figures moving between them. Through her scope, she counted at least 12 fighters, all carrying automatic weapons and moving with the discipline that suggested military training. But what caught her attention was the activity around the center vehicle. Men were unloading something heavy, working in coordinated teams that spoke of practice and planning. Sarah adjusted her scope and felt her breath catch when she realized what she was looking at. The object being carefully removed from the truck was clearly a weapons system, something too sophisticated for typical Taliban operations. Even at this distance, Sarah could see the distinctive shape of what appeared to be a surface-to-air missile launcher. This wasn't just another convoy moving supplies. This was a weapons transfer of major strategic importance. Sarah's mind raced through the implications. If Taliban forces had acquired advanced anti-aircraft missiles, it would fundamentally change the balance of power in the region. Coalition air support, the decisive advantage in most engagements, would be severely compromised. Helicopter operations, medical evacuations, supply runs, all would become exponentially more dangerous. She had to get closer. Moving carefully from cover to cover, Sarah began working her way toward the convoy. Her original mission parameters had been to observe and eliminate a high-value target. But this development clearly took priority. If she could gather detailed intelligence about this weapon's transfer, or better yet, disrupt it entirely, the tactical value would be enormous. The approach took her nearly an hour of careful movement. The valley floor offered decent cover in the form of rocky outcroppings and dried stream beds. But getting within effective rifle range required crossing several open areas where she would be completely exposed. Sarah planned each movement carefully, timing her advances to coincide with moments when the sentries were facing away or distracted by their own activities. At 400 meters, she found an ideal overwatch position behind a low ridge that provided both concealment and clear fields of fire. Through her scope, she could now see details that made her situation even more urgent. The weapons system wasn't just a single missile launcher. The fighters were assembling what appeared to be a complete mobile air defense platform, including radar guidance systems and multiple launch tubes. Sarah began photographing everything she could see, using the camera function on her rangefinder to document the weapons, the personnel, and the vehicles. Even if she couldn't stop this transfer herself, the intelligence would be invaluable for future operations. But as she watched the methodical assembly process, she realized that waiting for future operations might be too late. The missile system was nearly ready for deployment. Within hours, it could be moved to a position where it would threaten all coalition air operations in the region. Waiting for backup or extraction wasn't an option. Sarah would have to act alone. She began calculating angles and distances for the most effective attack. The fuel tanks of the vehicles would be her primary targets. A well-placed shot could create explosions that would destroy not only the weapons system, but also eliminate the fighters before they could scatter. It was a complex shot sequence that would require perfect timing and flawless execution. Sarah was lining up her first shot when movement on the ridgeline above the convoy caught her attention. Through her scope, she could see figures moving along the peaks, too distant to identify clearly, but definitely human. For a moment, she wondered if Taliban reinforcements were arriving, which would make her situation impossible. Then, she saw the distinctive outline of advanced tactical gear and realized these weren't Taliban fighters. Someone else was observing this weapons transfer, and based on their equipment and movement patterns, they were almost certainly coalition forces. The SEAL team that had been watching Sarah since her mountain engagement was now positioned to observe the same convoy she was targeting. Through their high-powered optics, they had identified the weapons transfer and were conducting their own surveillance. But they had also spotted the lone figure that had been tracking the convoy for hours. Team leader Chief Petty Officer Marcus Rodriguez studied the distant figure through his scope. Whoever this person was, they had demonstrated remarkable fieldcraft in approaching the convoy undetected. The positioning was excellent, the movement disciplined, and the patience professional. These weren't the characteristics of a Taliban fighter or even most coalition forces. This was someone with specialized training. Rodriguez faced a tactical dilemma. His team's mission was to gather intelligence on weapons transfers in this region, not to engage unless directly threatened. But the presence of another coalition operative, apparently conducting a solo mission, changed the dynamics significantly. If this person attempted to attack the convoy alone, they would likely be killed, but they might also compromise the SEAL team's position in the process. Through his scope, Rodriguez watched the figure make final adjustments to what was clearly a precision rifle. Whoever this was, they were preparing to engage 12 armed fighters single-handedly from a position that offered no escape route. It was either incredibly brave or completely insane, possibly both. Sarah had made her decision. The weapons transfer was too important to allow it to continue, regardless of the personal cost. She identified her target sequence. First, the fuel tank of the center vehicle to destroy the missile system. Then, the fuel tanks of the flanking vehicles to eliminate escape routes. Finally, individual targets as opportunity presented. She would have perhaps 30 seconds before return fire made her position untenable. Her finger was applying pressure to the trigger when a voice spoke quietly behind her. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." Sarah's blood turned to ice. Someone had approached her position without making a sound, gotten close enough to speak in a normal tone of voice. Every instinct screamed at her to roll and engage, but the voice had spoken in English with an American accent. She fought down the impulse to move and tried to assess this new situation. "Easy there, shooter. We're on the same side." The voice was calm, professional, with the kind of authority that comes from years of special operations. "Slowly put the rifle down and turn around. Keep your hands visible." Sarah complied, moving with deliberate care to avoid any action that might be interpreted as aggressive. When she turned, she found herself facing a man in advanced tactical gear that screamed special operations. His weapon was lowered but ready, his stance relaxed but alert. Behind him, partially concealed in the rocks, she could see at least two other figures in similar equipment. "Lieutenant Sarah Chun, 10th Mountain Division," she said quietly, maintaining eye contact while keeping her hands clearly visible. "Chief Rodriguez, Naval Special Warfare," the man replied. "What's a 10th Mountain sniper doing this deep in Indian country without support?" Sarah hesitated. Her mission briefing had emphasized operational security, and she had been given no information about other coalition units operating in this area. But her current situation made strict adherence to protocol somewhat academic. Either these were friendly forces, in which case cooperation made sense, or they weren't, in which case she was already compromised. Reconnaissance and elimination mission. High-value target was supposed to be in that convoy. She gestured toward the vehicles below. "Instead, I found this." Rodriguez studied her for a moment, processing the information and evaluating the situation. He had watched this woman systematically eliminate 4 enemy fighters in terrain that would challenge even his highly trained team. Her approach to the convoy had been textbook perfect, and her target selection showed tactical sophistication that impressed him. Whatever her original mission, she had clearly adapted to developing circumstances. "That weapon system changes everything," Rodriguez said. "Our intelligence indicated possible Taliban acquisition of advanced missiles, but this confirms it. Those aren't just surface-to-air missiles. That's a complete integrated air defense platform." Sarah nodded. "Which is why I was about to destroy it. One person might be able to eliminate the immediate threat, even if extraction becomes impossible. One person attacking 12 fighters from an exposed position is suicide," Rodriguez replied. "But 6 people with proper coordination might have different odds." The implication was clear. The SEAL team was prepared to incorporate Sarah into their operation, recognizing that her skills and position could be valuable assets. But it would require trust on both sides, and, in special operations, trust was something that had to be earned through action. Rodriguez made a decision that reflected both tactical necessity and professional respect. "Lieutenant, you've got 2 choices. You can continue with your solo mission, which will probably get you killed, and definitely alert every Taliban fighter in these mountains to increased coalition activity. Or you can work with us to complete an operation that might actually succeed." Sarah looked down at the convoy, then back at Rodriguez and his team. The tactical mathematics were obvious. 6 operators with coordinated planning and multiple firing positions would have vastly better odds than one person conducting a desperate attack. But joining their operation would mean abandoning her original mission parameters and trusting people she had never worked with before. "What did you have in mind, Chief?" Rodriguez smiled grimly. "We turn this valley into a kill zone and make sure that weapons system never leaves these mountains. But first, we need to know everything you observed during your approach, and you need to know how we operate." For the next 20 minutes, Sarah briefed the SEAL team on her observations of the convoy, the weapons system, and the tactical situation. In return, Rodriguez outlined their standard operational procedures and how she would fit into their attack plan. It was a rapid integration process that would have been impossible without Sarah's specialized training and the SEAL's professionalism. The plan that emerged was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its potential effectiveness. The SEAL team would establish firing positions on the ridgelines above the convoy, creating overlapping fields of fire that would prevent escape. Sarah would maintain her current position to provide precision fire on high-value targets, particularly the weapons system itself. The attack would be initiated by Sarah's shot into the fuel tank of the center vehicle. The explosion would create chaos and confusion while destroying the primary target. The SEAL team would then engage any survivors, ensuring that no intelligence about the operation could be reported back to Taliban leadership. But as they were finalizing the plan, new movement in the valley changed everything once again. A fourth vehicle was approaching the convoy from the opposite end of the valley, moving fast and kicking up a dust trail that could be seen from miles away. Through their scopes, the team could see that this wasn't another Taliban truck. The vehicle was a coalition forces armored car, and it was driving directly into what was about to become a combat zone. Rodriguez cursed under his breath as he recognized the tactical nightmare developing below them. Friendly forces were approaching an enemy position that his team was preparing to destroy. The timing couldn't have been worse, and the potential for friendly fire casualties had just increased exponentially. "Change of mission," he said grimly. "We need to warn that vehicle before they drive into an ambush." Sarah was already adjusting her scope, trying to identify the approaching coalition forces. Through the enhanced optics, she could see that the armored car contained at least 4 personnel, but the distance and movement made identification impossible. What was clear was that they had no idea what they were driving into. The Taliban fighters around the convoy had also spotted the approaching vehicle. Sarah could see them moving to defensive positions and preparing weapons for an ambush. The coalition armored car was driving straight into a trap, and there was no way to warn them without compromising the SEAL team's position. Rodriguez was faced with an impossible choice. He could maintain operational security and watch coalition forces drive into an ambush, or he could break cover to provide warning and lose any chance of destroying the weapons system. Either choice would likely result in friendly casualties and mission failure. Sarah solved his dilemma by making a choice of her own. Without waiting for orders or permission, she shifted her aim from the fuel tank to one of the Taliban fighters who was positioning a rocket-propelled grenade launcher to target the approaching vehicle. Her shot echoed across the valley just as the coalition armored car came within RPG range. The Taliban fighter dropped, his weapon tumbling into the rocks. The sound of the gunshot had the immediate effect of alerting both the convoy and the approaching coalition forces that they were in a combat situation. The valley exploded into chaos as automatic weapons fire erupted from multiple positions. The coalition armored car immediately stopped and began returning fire, their crew finally aware of the ambush they had driven into. The Taliban fighters around the convoy scattered to defensive positions, abandoning their orderly weapons transfer for a desperate firefight. Rodriguez and his team immediately began engaging targets from their elevated positions, their coordinated fire devastating the scattered enemy fighters. The tactical situation had completely changed from a planned precision strike to an immediate action drill. But the SEALs adapted with the fluid professionalism that defined their training. Sarah continued providing precision fire from her position, systematically eliminating Taliban fighters who tried to use the weapons system or escape vehicles for cover. Her shots were timed to support the SEAL team's assault, creating a deadly crossfire that trapped the enemy in the valley floor. The engagement lasted less than 10 minutes, but in that brief time, the carefully planned weapons transfer was completely destroyed. The missile system lay in burning wreckage, the convoy vehicles were disabled, and the Taliban fighters were either dead or scattered into the mountains. When the shooting stopped, the valley was quiet except for the crackling of burning vehicles and the settling of disturbed rocks. The coalition armored car began moving toward the destroyed convoy, its crew undoubtedly eager to secure any intelligence that might have survived the engagement. Rodriguez stood up from his firing position and looked down at Sarah, who was still maintaining overwatch on the valley floor. She had initiated the engagement without orders, adapted to changing circumstances without hesitation, and provided fire support that had been crucial to the operation's success. "Outstanding shooting, Lieutenant," he said simply. "You just saved those coalition forces and completed a mission that would have been impossible without your skills." The coalition armored car that had unknowingly driven into the ambush turned out to contain a recovery team sent to locate Sarah after her communications had gone dark. Staff Sergeant Mike Torres climbed out of the vehicle, his relief at finding her alive evident despite his attempt to maintain professional composure. Lieutenant Chun, command has been trying to reach you for 8 hours. When your last check-in failed to come through, they sent us to find your extraction point. Torres looked around the valley, taking in the burning vehicles and scattered equipment. Looks like you've been busy. Sarah exchanged glances with Chief Rodriguez, both of them aware that the recovery team's arrival complicated an already complex situation. The SEAL mission had been classified at a level that precluded sharing operational details with regular Army units. But Sarah's integration into their team had created an overlap that would require careful handling. Rodriguez stepped forward, his diplomatic skills developed through years of inter-service cooperation. Sergeant Torres, I'm Chief Rodriguez, Naval Special Warfare. Lieutenant Chun provided crucial support for our operation here. We'll need to coordinate our extraction procedures to ensure operational security. Torres studied the SEAL team leader, recognizing the authority in his voice and the implications of his presence. Special operations units didn't appear in remote Afghan valleys by accident, and their involvement suggested that Sarah's mission had intersected with something much larger than a routine reconnaissance operation. Chief, my orders are to extract Lieutenant Chun and return her to FOB Chapman for debriefing. I wasn't informed of any joint operations in this area. Torres was walking a careful line between following orders and acknowledging the tactical realities of the situation. Circumstances changed rapidly, Rodriguez replied. What started as separate missions became a coordinated operation when we encountered that weapons transfer. Lieutenant Chin's actions were instrumental in preventing those missiles from reaching their intended deployment. Sarah listened to the exchange while continuing to monitor the surrounding terrain through her scope. The engagement had been loud and dramatic, easily audible from miles away in these mountains. Taliban reinforcements would be responding to investigate, and their current position in the valley floor was tactically vulnerable once enemy forces occupied the commanding heights. Chief, Sergeant, we need to move, Sarah interrupted. This valley is going to be swarming with hostiles within the hour. We can sort out the extraction details from a more defensible position. Rodriguez nodded, recognizing the tactical urgency. Agreed. Sergeant Torres, can your vehicle transport additional personnel? We can fit everyone, but it'll be tight. Where are we heading? Rodriguez consulted his tactical GPS and map. There's a coalition checkpoint about 15 clicks north of here. We can coordinate proper extraction from there. He paused, looking at Sarah. Lieutenant, what's your assessment of Taliban response time? Sarah considered the question, drawing on her knowledge of enemy movement patterns in the region. Assuming they have spotters on the outer peaks, they'll have observed the engagement and are probably already organizing a response. Light infantry could be here in 30 to 45 minutes. Vehicles would take longer due to terrain, but they'll be bringing heavy weapons. Then, we need to be gone in 20, Rodriguez decided. He turned to his team. Standard extraction protocol. Destroy any sensitive equipment we can't carry. Police up anything that could provide intelligence value to the enemy. The next 15 minutes were a carefully choreographed ballet of professional soldiers preparing for departure under pressure. Sarah helped the SEALs ensure that no useful equipment or intelligence would be left behind for Taliban forces to exploit. Torres and his crew prepared their vehicle for the additional passengers and planned the route to the coalition checkpoint. Sarah took a moment to study the destroyed convoy through her scope one final time. The weapons system was completely destroyed, its sophisticated electronics melted into unrecognizable scrap metal. Several Taliban fighters lay dead around the vehicles, and those who had escaped had fled without taking any equipment. From an intelligence perspective, the operation had been a complete success. But, as she lowered her scope, movement on the distant ridgelines caught her attention. Small figures were moving along the peaks, too far away for positive identification, but clearly human. The Taliban response was already beginning, and it was larger than she had estimated. Chief, we've got movement on the eastern peaks. Multiple personnel, approaching fast. Sarah kept her voice calm, but urgent. Rodriguez immediately moved to where he could observe the ridgelines. Through his binoculars, he could see what Sarah had spotted, not just a few fighters responding to investigate, but what appeared to be organized units moving with purpose and coordination. That's at least 40 fighters, possibly more, he said grimly. They're moving to cut off our northern route. Torres overheard the assessment and felt his stomach tighten. His armored car could handle small arms fire, but 40 Taliban fighters would likely include heavy weapons that could disable or destroy his vehicle. The 15-kilometer run to the coalition checkpoint was suddenly looking much more dangerous. Chief, we need alternatives. If they're moving to block the northern route, what other options do we have? Torres was thinking like the experienced NCO he was, already planning contingencies. Rodriguez studied his map, evaluating terrain and distance factors. The valley system offered several potential routes, but all of them involved crossing open ground where they would be vulnerable to observation and attack. The Taliban forces moving into position clearly knew the local terrain better than any coalition unit, giving them significant tactical advantages. There's a secondary route through the western peaks, Rodriguez said finally. It's more difficult terrain, slower going, but it avoids the areas where they're positioning their forces. Sarah looked at the western route on the map and shook her head. That route goes through the Kandak Pass. Intelligence reports indicate that area is heavily mined from previous conflicts. We could be trading immediate contact for IED casualties. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. Every route offered significant risks, and remaining in their current position was becoming impossible as Taliban forces continued to move into the surrounding heights. Rodriguez was faced with the kind of decision that defines special operations leadership, choosing between multiple bad options based on incomplete information. We go north, he decided. Fast and aggressive. If we can reach the checkpoint before they complete their deployment, we avoid a prolonged engagement. Torres nodded, understanding the logic even as he recognized the risks. Speed would be their best defense, but it would also limit their ability to respond if they encountered obstacles or took fire. Everyone mount up. We leave in 2 minutes. Sarah gathered her equipment and prepared to board the armored car. Sarah didn't respond immediately. She was still watching the valley, still scanning for threats, still operating in the heightened awareness that defined combat. Only when she was satisfied that the area was secure did she finally relax her grip on her rifle and acknowledge the compliment. Just doing my job, Chief. But I appreciate the backup. What neither of them could know was that this engagement had been observed and recorded by Taliban spotters positioned on distant peaks. The destruction of the weapons system and the death of their fighters would be reported within hours, setting in motion a response that would make their current situation look simple by comparison. The real test was just beginning. Through their scopes, they watched the lone figure moving carefully down the mountain face, heading toward the valley where the convoy had been. Whoever this person was, they moved with purpose and confidence despite being completely alone in hostile territory. The SEAL team leader made a decision that would change everything. Instead of continuing with their original mission, they would follow this mysterious shooter and find out what kind of person could survive what they had just witnessed. Sarah Chun had no idea that she was being watched as she made her way toward the valley floor. Her focus was entirely on survival and figuring out how to complete her mission without support or communication. The fog was beginning to roll in again, providing cover but making navigation more difficult. She had been trained for situations like this, but training could never fully prepare someone for the reality of being completely alone in enemy territory. Every shadow could hide a threat. Every sound could signal approaching danger. The weight of solitude pressed down on her as heavily as the mountain air. But Sarah had something that couldn't be taught in any school or training program. She had an absolute refusal to give up, a determination forged in the mountains of Montana and tempered in the harsh realities of combat. She would complete her mission or die trying, but she would not quit. As she reached the valley floor and began following the tracks left by the convoy, Sarah had no way of knowing that her real test was just beginning. The engagement on the mountain had been a warm-up for what was coming next.